The torches burn low along the long stone corridor, their orange light trembling across cold gray walls. Outside, a slow wind moves through the trees, brushing against banners that hang from high battlements. The castle is quiet, half asleep. Only the distant crackle of fire and the soft tread of a guard's boots disturb the silence. It is a night like many in the Middle Ages, unhurried, shadowed, and filled with stories waiting to be told. In such nights, people spoke of heroes. Tales of gallant knights filled the halls, warriors clad in shining armor, defenders of kings and faith. They rode noble horses, carried bright swords, and lived for honor. To hear the stories was to believe that knighthood was the very peak of human courage. For a child listening in a corner of the hall, it seemed the only dream worth having. But dreams, even the shining ones, are never quite as smooth when touched by daylight. Behind every polished breastplate was a person who ached, sweated, doubted, and feared. The legend of the knight was bright enough to hide those truths, and for centuries it did. Tonight, we will lift that shining mask gently and look at the quieter, more human side of the story. Imagine being that child, perhaps 7 years old, born to a noble family. The stone floor beneath your feet is cold even in summer. You hear the echo of footsteps, the clang of metal in the training yard. Your small wooden toys are miniature swords and shields. And one morning, without much ceremony, you are told it is time to leave. You ride away from home not as a warrior, but as a page, an apprentice in another lord's castle. There your training begins. You learn to serve before you can command. You fetch water, polish armor, feed hunting dogs, and carry messages. You learn manners and prayers, how to sit, stand, and speak with respect. Each day begins at dawn and ends long after sunset. There are lessons in reading the scriptures, but also lessons in silence. You are watched, corrected, and molded. In the quiet hours after duties are done, you might look at the armor displayed in the great hall. It gleams faintly in the firelight, rows of metal plates, helmets, and shields painted with family crests. To a child, they seem magical, as though simply wearing them could turn you into something more than human. You cannot yet imagine the weight of that armor, or how the heat inside it will make sweat trickle down your back. You only see the shine. Years pass, and you become a squire. The tasks grow heavier. You clean weapons, care for horses, and accompany your master into practice fields. You learn how to mount, how to balance a shield, how to swing a sword without losing your footing. You also learn pain, small, everyday pain, blisters on the hand, bruises that darken and fade, the strain of endless drills. Yet every ache feels like progress, another step toward the title you seek. To be a knight means to live by a code: courage, loyalty, and courtesy. You're told to protect the weak, to honor your word, to serve your Lord, and to trust in God. These words are beautiful, almost musical, and they will be repeated for centuries in poems and songs. But in the real world of stone castles and muddy roads, living by those words is not simple. The Middle Ages were not a peaceful time. Knights had to balance faith with survival, duty with desire, and sometimes truth with obedience. Still, when the trumpets sounded and the banners were raised, a knight's presence was a symbol of order. People looked to them for protection, for justice, for strength. Children cheered as they rode through towns, their armor glinting like mirrors in the sun. The dream of knighthood lived on in the eyes of those who watched, and in the hearts of those who believed. Yet every knight, no matter how strong, knew the quieter side of his journey. He knew the long nights in tents, the rain that soaked through cloaks, the endless travel along rough roads. He knew that the weight of armor was not only physical, it was also the weight of expectations. A single act of fear or failure could stain a reputation forever. And so, many knights lived not for glory, but simply not to disappoint. When the day's duties were done, some found comfort in prayer, others in quiet conversation, a warm meal, or the rhythm of horse hooves beneath the stars. These were the moments that the songs never captured, the peaceful silences, the reflection, the simple wish for rest. As centuries passed, the world remembered only the shining parts. The legends grew taller, the heroes braver, the battles grander. But beneath those bright stories was always the same truth. To be a knight was to live a life of discipline, sacrifice, and solitude. So as you listen now, let the torches flicker softly in your imagination. Hear the distant echo of armor in the corridor, the gentle clop of hooves fading down a moonlit path. The dream of being a knight was a dream of purpose, but it came with a price that few would truly wish to pay. And as the candlelight dims in our story's hall, remember this: the armor that shone so brightly by day was at night only metal resting on a wooden stand, silent, heavy, waiting for another dawn. In that silence, our tale takes its first breath. The dream has begun, and the truth, wrapped in steel, is waiting to be told. The story of a knight does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in a quiet nursery, in the echoing halls of a castle, or sometimes in the modest home of a minor noble family. Before a sword is ever lifted, before armor ever touches skin, there is a child, watching, learning, and dreaming of greatness. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the world of a noble child was both privileged and restricted. Born into comfort, yes, but also into expectation. Every glance, every lesson, every whispered prayer shaped a life that was not entirely their own. The destiny of a young boy was often decided long before he could understand the meaning of honor or duty. At around the age of 7, a boy chosen for knighthood would leave his home. There were no long goodbyes, no dramatic farewells, just a quiet morning, a small bundle of belongings, and the long ride to another lord's castle. It was the first lesson in the life of a knight. Service begins with obedience. The castle that welcomed him was not his own, but it would be his world for the next several years. Here, he became a page, a humble servant in training. His days followed a strict rhythm marked by the bells of the chapel. At dawn, he would rise, wash in cold water, and dress neatly.
After that came work, simple, repetitive, yet important. He would sweep floors, carry messages, and attend the needs of the household. He learned table manners, how to carve meat with grace, how to serve nobles during feasts without spilling a drop. These lessons in patience and composure were as vital as learning to wield a sword. When the day's chores ended, training began. Not with real weapons, but with wooden swords, balance drills, and riding lessons. The young page learned how to care for horses, brushing their manes, cleaning their hooves, whispering softly to calm them. In time, the boy and the horse grew inseparable, learning to trust each other's movements long before they ever entered a field of battle. The nights were long in a castle. The great hall glowed with candlelight, and from the shadows the pages would listen to minstrels and storytellers. They heard of great warriors who defended kings, rescued the helpless, and swore eternal loyalty to their lords. The music was soft and full of wonder, and for a child half asleep by the fire, Those stories became dreams. But the older he grew, the more he learned that stories and realities seldom walked hand in hand. A knight's glory was rare, his effort constant. The young page began to notice the weight of armor, the fatigue in his master's eyes, the silence between words at the dining table. Even heroes grew tired. As years passed, the page transformed into a squire, usually around the age of 14. With this new title came greater trust and heavier tasks. He now accompanied a knight directly, helping him dress for ceremonies or for combat training. The squire learned how to fasten armor correctly, how to tie the leather straps, polish each piece of steel until it shone, and adjust the joints so they would not pinch or chafe. It was precise work, and it demanded patience. He also learned discipline through service. A knight's horse was his most prized possession, and caring for it was an art form. The squire would brush the animal's coat until it gleamed, feed it measured portions, and walk it gently after long rides. The sound of hooves in the courtyard became the rhythm of his days. Evenings brought lessons of a different kind. The squire practiced swordplay under his master's watchful eye, steady, careful movements, more dance than duel. The goal was not aggression, but control. The knight reminded him that victory came from calmness, not anger. Each mistake was met not with harshness, but with quiet correction. Slowly, grace replaced clumsiness. Between lessons, there were moments of reflection. The castle's chapel offered stillness, a place to kneel, to breathe, and to think. The squire learned not only physical strength, but humility. He was taught that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of standing firm despite it. The older knights often told stories by the fire, not of battles, but of choices, moments where duty outweighed comfort, where silence carried more honor than shouting. These stories stayed with the young squire, shaping his view of what knighthood truly meant. As he approached adulthood, the dream of becoming a knight drew closer, yet it no longer shone with the same golden glow of childhood. He understood now that the armor did not make the man. It only reflected the person inside it, his discipline, patience, and humility. Before receiving the title of Sir, he would spend one final night alone in prayer. In a quiet chapel, candles flickering softly, he would cleanse his soul and his heart, preparing for the ceremony ahead. It was not the crowning of a hero, but the beginning of a lifelong duty, to protect, to serve, and to endure. For many, the path from page to squire to knight took over a decade. It was not just physical preparation, it was emotional, spiritual, and moral training. The armor that once seemed so grand now carried meaning far deeper than appearance. And so, as the morning sun rose through the castle's narrow windows, casting golden lines across the floor, the young man who began as a boy with dreams now stood at the edge of his destiny. The path of childhood had ended. Ahead lay a new road, heavier and lonelier, but filled with purpose. For the knight's story, like the steel he would wear, had been forged not in a single moment of glory, but in years of quiet endurance. The child had become the man of iron, and the dream, once bright and distant, was now a promise bound by duty. The word chivalry often floats through the air like a song from another time, sweet, noble, and full of promise. It calls to mind knights bowing before ladies, defending the weak and upholding justice with grace and courage. In stories, it shines like polished steel. But in the quiet light of history, chivalry was both a dream and a discipline, an ideal that few could truly live by, yet many tried to honor in their own imperfect ways. When a squire was finally deemed ready to become a knight, the ceremony was deeply symbolic. It was called the dubbing. He would spend a night in prayer, fasting, and reflection, dressed in white robes to represent purity. At dawn, he would kneel before his lord, who would touch his shoulders lightly with the flat of a sword and speak the solemn words, "Be thou a knight." It was not just a title, it was a vow, a quiet promise to live by a code greater than oneself. That code was chivalry. The code of chivalry was not written in a single book or law. It lived through the traditions of noble families, through songs and sermons, and through the expectations of a society that longed for order in a harsh world. It asked knights to be loyal to their lords, kind to the poor, faithful to God, and honorable in every act. It was a rule of conduct meant to bring dignity to strength. Yet the world outside the castle walls was not a world of ideals. It was a world of hunger, ambition, and endless conflict. And so knights often found themselves balancing between what they were taught to be and what they needed to do to survive. In peaceful times, the code of chivalry shaped manners and behavior. A true knight was expected to speak with courtesy, to show mercy, to protect women and children, and to keep his word even when it brought hardship. His conduct was meant to be as polished as his armor. These were not just gestures, they were symbols of civilization in an age that often teetered on the edge of chaos. But in times of war, those same ideals were tested. A knight might pledge loyalty to his lord, only to see that lord change sides in a political struggle. He might promise to protect the weak, but be ordered to defend a cause that harmed them. Honor and duty did not always walk together, and many knights, though noble in name, were still human in their choices, capable of courage, yes, but also of pride and error. Still, the dream of chivalry mattered. It gave meaning to an otherwise brutal life. It whispered of fairness, restraint, and compassion. It reminded those who wielded power that strength was meant to protect, not to dominate. And though not every knight lived by those words, many carried them quietly, trying in small ways to live up to the stories they were told of them.
In a way, chivalry was a mirror, one that showed knights not as they were, but as they wished to be. It was a guidepost, pointing toward gentleness in a world of iron. On quiet evenings, a knight might sit by a fire, reading from a small book of prayers or listening to a minstrel sing of heroes who kept their word even unto death. The music was soft, the candlelight warm, and in those moments, chivalry felt real, not as a set of rules, but as a feeling that lived in the heart. The concept of courtly love also grew from this same idealized world. It spoke of admiration from afar, of devotion expressed through poems and service rather than passion or possession. To love nobly was to respect, to honor, to place the other's virtue above one's desire. Though much of it was poetic fancy, it softened the culture around knighthood, teaching that tenderness was not weakness but refinement. But as centuries passed, people began to notice the gap between the shining words of the code and the daily life of those who swore to uphold it. Some knights became symbols of honor, others were feared more than respected. Power often pulled men away from purity, and ambition dulled the edge of virtue. Still, even when the practice failed, the idea endured. Perhaps that was the real magic of chivalry, not that it was perfectly lived, but that it was endlessly aspired to. It kept alive the belief that discipline and kindness could exist together, that courage and humility could belong to the same soul. And even today, when we speak of someone being chivalrous, we echo that ancient dream, that strength should serve goodness, that courage should be gentle, and that honor, once given, should never be broken. For the knights of old, this idea was both their burden and their light. They carried it through cold campaigns and lonely roads, through tournaments and prayers, knowing that the code was not just about victory, it was about dignity. So, as the candle burns low in the great hall of memory, let us imagine one knight sitting silently by the window, his armor resting nearby. Outside, the night hums softly. The stars gleam like tiny shields in the sky. He has seen enough to know that perfection is a myth. But still, he whispers the code's words under his breath, not because the world demands it, but because he wishes it were true. In that whisper lives the heart of chivalry, fragile, hopeful, and enduring. Before dawn, when the air is still cool and pale light begins to touch the stones of the courtyard, a knight prepares for his day. The morning is silent except for the faint call of a distant bird and the low murmur of squires moving carefully between rows of armor stands. Each piece of armor gleams softly in the early light, steel polished to a quiet silver, leather straps hanging like vines from branches of iron. To most, it looks magnificent, almost royal, but to the man who must wear it, every piece carries weight, literal and symbolic. Armor was not a single suit, but a collection of parts. The helmet, the breastplate, the backplate, the greaves for the legs, the gauntlets for the hands, and the chainmail beneath it all. Each part had a purpose, protecting the body like the layers of a shell. When assembled, the suit could weigh anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds. For a knight, that meant not just bearing the armor, but learning to move as if it were part of his own body. The process of dressing took time. It could not be done alone. Squires worked with practiced hands, fastening buckles, tying cords, and checking every joint. The knight would stand patiently, arms raised slightly, as the layers were added one by one. First the padded tunic, then the chainmail, then the plates of steel that gleamed like mirrors. The sound was rhythmic, metal brushing against leather, buckles snapping shut, the soft creak of straps being tightened. For the young squires, it was an honor to help prepare their master. For the knight, it was a moment of quiet reflection. He would feel the growing heaviness on his shoulders, the narrowing of breath as the chest plate settled into place, and the subtle stiffness that came with protection. The armor was safety, but also confinement. Once dressed, the knight would test his movement, raising an arm, bending a knee, turning his head beneath the visor. The armor made even simple motions deliberate and slow. Each step echoed across the courtyard like a quiet drumbeat. The sun would rise higher, catching the metal in flashes of light. From a distance, he might appear invincible, a figure of shining strength. Up close, one could see the sweat beginning to gather at his brow. In stories and paintings, armor looks like glory made solid. But in truth, it was labor. It was heat in summer, cold in winter, and constant maintenance. Steel rusted quickly, and chainmail had to be oiled and repaired link by link. Every dent told a story, and every story needed care to keep it from becoming a weakness. Beyond its weight, armor carried meaning. It was the outward sign of a knight's duty, his class, and his faith. The cross often etched into the breastplate was not decoration, but devotion. It reminded the wearer that his strength was a gift to be used wisely. To lose one's armor in battle, or to be stripped of it in distress, was not merely physical loss, it was a loss of honor. Yet, the armor could not protect everything. It guarded the body, but not the heart. Beneath all the steel and padding, there was still a man who could feel fear, exhaustion, and doubt. The armor might hide the trembling of his hands, but it could not silence his thoughts. Many knights, after long days in armor, spoke of the relief of removing it, the moment when the straps loosened and fresh air touched the skin again. It felt like freedom returning, if only for a little while. Armor also shaped how others saw the knight. To peasants, it made him seem distant, almost unreal, a figure apart from the world of ordinary people. To fellow soldiers, it was a mark of respect, a symbol of discipline. And to poets and storytellers, it became a metaphor for everything noble and enduring about the human spirit. In the hush of evening, after a day of training or travel, a knight might sit quietly beside his armor stand. The pieces would rest in order, each gleaming faintly in the firelight. He might run a cloth over the metal, removing dust or fingerprints, his thoughts as slow and measured as his movements. There was something almost meditative in the act. care, attention, patience. To wear armor was to understand balance, the balance between strength and restraint, between power and humility. It reminded a knight that protection always came with cost, and that the greatest battles were often fought not with weapons, but within oneself.
Even in times of peace, armor remained a companion. It traveled wherever the knight did, through forests, across fields, to tournaments and ceremonies. It was both shield and shadow. When sunlight struck its surface, it shone like hope. When moonlight touched it, it looked almost ghostly, a reminder of how thin the line was between safety and surrender. Many centuries later, pieces of armor still survive, displayed in museums, polished and still. People walk past them and marvel at the craftsmanship, the artistry of the metalwork. Few stop to imagine the sound of it moving, the weight of it pressing against muscle and bone, the quiet endurance of the one who wore it. For that is what armor truly represents: endurance. The ability to carry burdens with dignity, to move forward despite heaviness. It is a lesson that outlives the age of knights. As the night deepens in our story, picture the armor resting on its stand, catching the faint glow of the hearth. The knight has unbuckled the last strap and placed his helmet gently beside it. The room is still, save for the sound of wind against the shutters. For now, the weight is lifted. Tomorrow will bring it again. But tonight, he rests, not as a symbol, not as a warrior, but as a man who has learned the quiet strength of carrying what must be carried. Before a knight ever rode into the noise of battle, he lived in the quiet rhythm of training. Every movement, every breath, every lesson was preparation. It was not about victory, it was about control, of body, of mind, and of fear. In the courtyard of a medieval castle, mornings began early. The air was cool and smelled faintly of dew on stone. The sun had not yet risen high, and yet the first sounds were already there. The thud of wooden swords meeting, the steady breathing of squires practicing their drills. A knight's training was constant. The human body was not made to carry heavy armor or swing a sword for hours, so the knight had to teach it patience. He would practice balance first, learning to move with grace despite the weight of steel. Walking, turning, kneeling, and rising became daily rituals. Each motion was repeated until it no longer needed thought. The sword, though famous in legend, was only one of many tools. Knights learned to handle the lance, the mace, the axe, and the shield. But in training, real weapons were often replaced with wooden versions, not for safety alone, but to allow endurance. A wooden sword could be swung for longer, teaching stamina without harm. There was discipline in every movement. The knight learned to breathe with rhythm, to strike not with anger, but with focus. A good knight, they said, did not fight to destroy, but to defend. His purpose was not glory, but service. When the day grew warmer, the training continued on horseback. The bond between knight and horse was sacred, a partnership of trust. Horses were trained as carefully as their riders, learning to respond to the lightest pressure of a leg or touch of a hand. A true knight never shouted commands. He guided quietly. The animal understood him through patience and respect. In tournaments, knights tested their skill against each other, not in the chaos of war, but in controlled displays of strength and accuracy. These events drew crowds and music and color, But beneath the cheer was serious purpose. The joust, the melee, the skill at arms, all were lessons dressed as spectacle. They taught endurance, timing, and courage. Training was not only physical, it was moral and spiritual. A knight was expected to study, to pray, and to live by codes of conduct known as chivalry. He learned generosity, humility, and faithfulness. He was taught to respect the weak, to serve his lord, and to seek peace even when he was trained for conflict. These ideals were as heavy as his armor, and just as hard to carry. When he was not practicing with weapons, the knight might spend his hours caring for his equipment. Armor needed cleaning, swords needed sharpening, horses needed feeding. Every part of a knight's life revolved around readiness. Readiness for duty, for travel, for command. In quieter moments, away from the clatter of practice, the knight might look toward the horizon and wonder. He might think of home, of the people he swore to protect, or of the uncertain future that waited beyond each dawn. For though he trained for battle, many knights spent years without ever seeing one. Their greatest test was patience, waiting for a call that might never come. The idea of combat in those times was not as grand as poems suggested. It was often confusion and endurance rather than heroism. A knight's skill was measured not only by strength, but by composure. The ability to remain calm, to protect one's comrades, and to keep order amidst chaos was the true mark of mastery. Yet beyond the field and the courtyard, life had gentler sides. There were feast days, ceremonies, and gatherings. A knight might teach his squires the art of courtesy, how to bow, how to speak respectfully, how to treat others with kindness. For chivalry extended beyond the battlefield. It lived in daily life. At sunset, when the long hours of training ended, the courtyard grew still. The squires collected the wooden swords, the horses were led back to their stalls, and the air carried the scent of straw and metal. The knight would remove his armor piece by piece, feeling lighter with each motion. His muscles ached, his hands were sore, but there was quiet pride in his heart. He would eat simply, often bread and broth, and speak little. Words were saved for prayer. He would thank the heavens for strength and safety, for his horse, his comrades, and his purpose. Then, beneath the flickering light of a torch, he would rest, body weary, mind calm. In dreams, perhaps, he would see himself not as a warrior, but as a guardian of peace. For in the end, all the training, all the rituals of endurance were meant for one thing, not to conquer, but to preserve. Through the centuries, the image of the knight has changed, but his discipline remains a timeless lesson. To train without arrogance, to carry strength with humility, to live with purpose, even in stillness. And as the night deepens, imagine the soft clatter of practice fading into silence. The torches burn lower. The stars begin to watch over the castle walls. The knight sleeps, his armor resting nearby, his horse breathing gently in the stables. Another day will come, another dawn of patience, training, and quiet resolve. For that is what true knighthood always was. Not a battle, but a way of being. The morning of battle did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, through a pale mist rising from the fields, through the soft creak of leather, through the murmured prayers of men who were already awake long before dawn, the world seemed to hold its breath.
For a knight, this moment was the threshold between discipline and uncertainty. The years of training, the vows of loyalty, the endless preparation, all led to this. And yet, no amount of training could truly prepare the heart for what awaited beyond the horizon. The armor, polished and perfect at sunrise, would feel heavier than ever. The weight was no longer only of steel, but of responsibility. Behind every knight stood those he protected, villages, families, lands entrusted to his care. Each step forward was taken for something greater than himself. The banners were lifted high, the colors bright against the early light, reds, blues, golds, and white crosses that fluttered in the breeze. To those watching from a distance, it might have looked almost beautiful. Rows of riders, the soft glint of helmets, the disciplined motion of horses. But beauty on the battlefield was fragile, lasting only until the wind shifted and reality returned. When orders were given, the calm broke. The knights moved as one, guided by horns and shouts, advancing across fields that would soon be marked by the memory of struggle. And yet, even here, among confusion and fear, there was a strange rhythm, a music of hoofbeats, the ring of metal, the cry of commands. What we remember today as glory was, in truth, endurance. There was no time for triumph, only survival. A knight's task was not to seek fame, but to hold his ground, to protect, to obey. Many times the fight was long before swords ever touched, a battle of will, of faith, of standing firm when everything inside urged retreat. In the stories told later, poets would turn these moments into legends. They would speak of brave charges and shining victories, of honor won and evil defeated. Yet those who lived through it remembered something different: the exhaustion, the noise, the uncertainty. They remembered the silence afterward, when the banners no longer moved and the world seemed older somehow. When the battle ended, knights would gather their strength in the quiet that followed. The air would be still again, and the fields would seem to exhale after holding breath for too long. Some would kneel and offer prayers, not for victory, but for mercy, for peace, for the simple blessing of seeing another dawn. Even in moments of triumph, there was humility. A true knight did not celebrate the fall of others. He gave thanks that duty had been fulfilled. His victory was not measured by conquest, but by survival, by the hope that his service had meaning. The horror of battle was not only in danger, it was in the transformation it demanded. The knight, trained to uphold ideals of faith and chivalry, was forced to face the frailty of all human things. He learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of standing still in spite of it. Afterward, when the noise was gone, the knight would feel the world again, the wind brushing past, the warmth of sunlight on armor. He might hear a bird call in the distance, or the soft steps of a horse beside him. Those small, ordinary sounds were the most precious, reminders that life, fragile and unassuming, still continued. Many knights carried these memories with quiet hearts. They did not speak of what they saw. They returned to their duties, to their lands, to their prayers, and allowed the legends to tell the story instead. The poets would sing of shining heroes, while the knights themselves remained silent, content to fade into history's deeper shadows. In time, the battlefield became a symbol, not just of war, but of the human spirit's test. It was where ideals met reality, where honor was tried, and where every knight discovered what kind of person he truly was. The glory of the battlefield lived in stories, but the truth lived in silence, in the long walks home, in the care for the wounded, in the rebuilding that came after. Those moments, unseen by poets, were the real measure of courage. As night falls in our story, imagine the field now empty beneath a silver sky. The banners are still. The grass moves gently in the breeze. The moonlight touches the armor of a lone figure, sitting quietly beside his horse. He breathes deeply, the sound calm and steady. There is no triumph here, no song, only peace at last. He looks toward the horizon where the stars begin to bloom. The world feels vast again, and his thoughts drift to the ones he loves, to the home that waits, to the hope that tomorrow will bring gentler days. For every night, glory and horror were two sides of the same coin, both heavy, both fleeting. But in the stillness of night, he understood that neither truly defined him. What mattered most was that he had done his duty with honor, and that he had endured. And so, beneath the quiet moon, he removes his helmet, closes his eyes, and lets the world grow silent once more. The wind whispers softly through the grass, carrying away the last echoes of the day. The battle is over, but the story continues, in lessons, in memory, in the quiet truth that even the bravest hearts long for peace. The stories of knights often end with shining victories and noble vows. Songs tell of courage, loyalty, and faith. Yet beneath those golden words lies a quieter truth, that honor, like steel, is beautiful but heavy. And sometimes the price of carrying it was more than a man could bear. In the medieval world, the word honor was everything. It shaped reputations, opened doors, and defined a man's worth. But it was not always earned through noble deeds. Many knights served not for ideals, but for duty. And that duty was to their lord, not always to justice. The feudal world was built like a ladder. At the top stood the king, below him powerful lords, and below them the knights, bound by oaths of loyalty. Those oaths were sacred, spoken in candlelight, sealed with promises to defend, to obey, to serve. Yet what happened when a lord's command clashed with a knight's conscience? For many, there was no question. Obedience came first. A knight's honor was tied not to personal belief, but to his word. Once he swore allegiance, that vow was unbreakable. To disobey meant shame, exile, or worse, dishonor. And so, knights often found themselves riding into conflicts they did not understand, fighting for causes that were not their own. The battlefield might be far from home, the people unknown, the purpose uncertain. But a knight's duty was clear, to serve his master faithfully. It was a loyalty that brought both respect and sorrow, because while poets praised their devotion, few spoke of the doubts that weighed on their hearts. Politics shaped much of a knight's world. Behind the banners and ceremonies, lords and kings played a quiet game of power. Alliances formed and broken, promises made and forgotten. A knight could find himself serving one ruler today and standing against him tomorrow, not out of choice, but command. Betrayal was not always born of hatred. Sometimes it was written in silence, hidden within royal letters, whispered across tables by men wearing velvet robes. And the knights, armored and sworn, became pieces in a game they did not design.
Imagine, then, the weight of that realization. To dedicate your life to duty, only to see that duty used for ambition. to raise your sword for justice, only to find yourself enforcing another's greed. It was a kind of fatigue deeper than physical, an exhaustion of the spirit. Many knights carried that fatigue quietly. They spoke little, prayed often, and trusted that their vows still held meaning beyond politics. They believed that faithfulness itself, the act of keeping one's word, was honorable, even when the cause was not. It was a fragile kind of hope, but it kept them steady through uncertain times. At court, the world seemed gentler. Bright halls, music, laughter, and silk banners. Yet beneath the surface, politics flowed like an unseen river. Alliances could shift overnight. A single word whispered in the wrong ear could end a career. A knight might spend years earning favor, only to lose it in a moment's turn of fortune. Loyalty, it seemed, was both a blessing and a burden. It gave purpose, but it demanded everything. Some knights found peace in service, finding dignity in their discipline. Others struggled, torn between obedience and integrity. And in that struggle lay the true cost of honor. To remain loyal was not always to be right. To disobey was not always to be wrong. The line between the two was as thin as the edge of a blade. A knight could be both hero and servant, protector and prisoner, all at once. There were those who questioned the system quietly, in private prayers or late-night reflections. They wondered if chivalry had lost its meaning, if honor had become a word used by the powerful to bind the obedient. Yet even in doubt, they kept faith in the idea that their service meant something, that perhaps, in the eyes of God, their sincerity mattered more than the commands they followed. As years passed, many knights grew weary not of battle, but of purpose. The endless oaths, the shifting loyalties, the ceremonies of obedience, all left little room for peace of mind. Some retired to quiet lands, tending to fields or founding small chapels. Others continued to serve, their hearts heavy, but their duty unbroken. In the dim light of evening, a knight might remove his armor and stare at the crest engraved on his shield, the symbol of a lord he once served proudly, now distant or forgotten. He might run his fingers over the worn lines, remembering all that it once meant, and perhaps, in that moment, he would realize that honor had changed shape, no longer belonging to a title or command, but to his own perseverance. True honor, he would understand at last, was not found in banners or in the praise of lords. It lived in quiet choices, in kindness, in truth, in the strength to carry on even when no one was watching. And so, as night settles on our story, imagine him standing at the edge of a hill, looking over his homeland. The wind moves softly through the grass. The stars shimmer faintly above. He breathes deeply, the armor at his side, the years behind him. He has served, he has endured, he has questioned, and through it all he has remained steadfast. That is the truest kind of honor, not the one won in battle or granted by kings, but the one kept alive within the heart, quiet and unwavering. Not every day in a knight's life was filled with battles or grand adventures. In truth, most days were slow, quiet, and ordinary. The kind of days that passed without notice, like the steady turning of a wheel. Between wars and journeys, life inside the castle walls was a rhythm of routine, prayer, training, and patience. The castle at dawn was a world of soft sounds. The first light touched the high windows, turning the stone walls a gentle gold. Servants moved through corridors, carrying water jugs and wooden trays. Somewhere below, a cook stirred a pot near the fire, and the smell of bread drifted upward through narrow halls. For the knight, morning began early. He would rise before the bell, when the air was still cool and damp, and the only sound was the echo of his own footsteps on the stone. The first duty of the day was prayer. In the small chapel within the castle, the knight would kneel before the altar, the faint light of candles flickering on his armor. He prayed not for victory, but for guidance, for strength, humility, and peace. After prayer came a simple meal, bread, cheese, and sometimes a cup of watered wine. Conversation was quiet. There was no rush. Each day felt much like the one before. Life in peacetime moved slowly, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Once breakfast ended, the knight turned to training. Even in peace, a knight was never idle. The courtyard would come alive with motion, wooden swords striking against posts, squires leading horses in circles, the dull rhythm of arrows hitting straw targets. The sounds echoed between the stone walls, filling the air with a sense of purpose. Training was not only to prepare for war. It was a discipline of the mind, a way to keep the body strong and the spirit focused. The knight might practice with his sword for an hour, then ride through the nearby fields to keep his horse agile. The animals were his constant companions. Each required care, attention, and trust. Maintenance was a quiet ritual, the sound of cloth against metal, the slow rhythm of breath, the scent of oil and earth. Afternoons were often still. The castle would fall into a hush, disturbed only by the distant clatter of servants or the caw of birds beyond the walls. The knight might spend time reading, perhaps a psalm, a letter from a distant lord, or the stories of other knights long gone. If he could read Latin, he might study old texts on virtue or theology. For those who could not, there were stories told aloud by traveling monks or minstrels, their voices soft and slow. Sometimes the stillness turned into something heavier, boredom. Between campaigns, there was little to do but wait, waiting for news, for duty, for the next command. A knight might wander the battlements, watching the fields stretch endlessly in all directions. The land was peaceful, yet his mind restless. The armor that once felt empowering now seemed unnecessary, a reminder of a purpose not yet called upon. In those long, quiet months, patience became his greatest trial. The songs of glory sung by poets never spoke of boredom, the kind that crept into the heart and tested endurance more than any sword fight could. The life of a knight was not always heroic. It was often simply repetitive, filled with chores and small duties that kept the world running smoothly.
As the sun dipped low, the evening bell would ring. Supper was served in the great hall, a modest meal of stew, bread, and ale. Laughter would sometimes fill the air, but even joy was tempered with restraint. The knight would sit beside his fellow men-at-arms, speaking softly of horses, lands, or weather, rarely of war, rarely of dreams. After supper came evening prayer once again. The castle chapel glowed with the warm light of candles. Shadows stretched long across the floor. The knight would bow his head, whispering words of gratitude for another peaceful day. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the towers, and the stars appeared one by one above the battlements. When the prayers ended, silence returned. Servants banked the fires. Dogs curled near doorways. The corridors grew dim. The knight would walk slowly through them, his footsteps echoing softly off the stone, his shadow flickering along the walls. Sometimes he paused by the narrow windows, looking out across the sleeping fields. The torches along the outer walls shimmered faintly, and beyond them, darkness stretched, endless and calm. In that stillness, the knight felt both small and content. He would remove his armor piece by piece, setting it carefully upon its stand. The sound of metal settling was strangely comforting, a reminder that even strength must rest. He would sit by the small fire in his chamber, the light dancing gently on the walls, and allow his thoughts to wander. Tomorrow would be the same, another morning of prayer, another day of training, another night of quiet reflection. But there was peace in the repetition. The castle, with its stone walls and slow rhythm, became a kind of sanctuary, a world where time itself seemed to sleep. And as he finally lay down, the distant sound of the wind through the courtyard would lull him toward dreams. Dreams not of battles or banners, but of calm mornings, soft prayers, and the endless patience of stone. Because, in truth, the life of a knight was not only about courage or war, it was about endurance, the quiet strength to live faithfully through the ordinary, to find meaning in stillness, and to serve with dignity even when no one was watching. The night deepens, the torches fade, the castle breathes in silence once more. And somewhere, in the still heart of that ancient fortress, a knight sleeps, his sword resting by his side, his duty resting within his heart. The shining image of a medieval knight, polished armor, fine horses, rich banners fluttering in the wind, was, for many, only that, an image. Behind the gleam of metal and the quiet songs of glory lay the weight of reality, heavy and unspoken. Being a knight was not only an honor, it was a costly duty. And for many men, it was a struggle to simply remain one. From the outside, a knight appeared prosperous. His armor gleamed in the sunlight, his horse was strong and well-fed, and his clothes bore the fine embroidery of his house. But appearances were everything in the medieval world, and they came at a price. To be a knight was to live under constant expectation, to maintain dignity, to represent the power of one's lord, and to carry oneself with grace and strength, yet behind that noble image were endless expenses. Armor alone could cost more than a small farm. A single horse, trained for battle and bred for endurance, was a treasure in itself, and that horse needed feed, care, a stable, and attendance. Even when there were no wars to fight, the costs did not stop. Armor rusted, saddles wore thin, and weapons needed sharpening. Every piece of equipment required constant care, and each repair demanded coin. Many knights owned lands, but not all were wealthy enough for those lands to sustain them. Harvests could fail. Tenants might leave. The income of a knight could disappear with a single season's bad weather. In many cases, knights borrowed money from merchants or local lords just to maintain their image. Debt was a quiet shadow that followed them wherever they went. A knight could not appear poor. His reputation depended on the illusion of wealth. He might wear a new cloak to a feast, even while his purse was nearly empty. He might host guests with fine meals, knowing that the bread and meat had been purchased on borrowed silver. Some knights tried to marry into wealth, joining families that could help ease their burdens. Others relied on the generosity of their lords, gifts of land, coin, or the spoils of war. Yet even these were uncertain. A change in favor, a lost campaign, or a single political shift could erase security overnight. Life as a knight was a delicate balance between pride and poverty. There was dignity in the title, but little safety in it.
The armor that once symbolized strength now represented a chain of obligation, shining, heavy, and impossible to remove. When debts grew too great, some knights sold their lands, their horses, even their swords. Others sought service under foreign banners, trading loyalty for coin. There were stories of noblemen who, after years of faithful duty, lived their last days in modest rooms, far from the halls they once guarded. Still, even amid hardship, many knights clung to a quiet sense of honor. They believed that duty and faith mattered more than wealth, yet the world around them rarely rewarded such virtues. Gold often spoke louder than courage. At night, when the castle fell silent and the fires dimmed, a knight might sit alone in his chamber, a single candle burning beside him. The wax melted slowly, forming small rivers along the brass holder. He might look at his sword resting nearby, polished, sharp, a symbol of service, and wonder how much it had truly cost him, not just in silver, but in years, in peace, in freedom. There was a certain stillness in that reflection, the quiet understanding that even glory came with a price. The songs of minstrels rarely told of debt collectors, unpaid squires, or the weight of unpaid taxes. But for many knights, those were the real battles of their lives. Yet there was dignity in endurance. To rise each morning, to polish armor that might never again see war, to greet one's lord with respect despite the burden of worry, these small acts held their own kind of heroism. They were not sung about in halls or written into scrolls, but they built the quiet backbone of the medieval world. Sometimes the knight would walk along the ramparts at dusk, watching the fields below. The land stretched wide and calm, dotted with villages and farms that worked to feed the castle. He might think of the peasants, living simple lives untouched by the weight of nobility. Their burdens were different, but perhaps not heavier. There was a strange envy in that thought, the peace of simplicity, the freedom from appearances. The illusion of wealth could feel like a gilded cage. To maintain it required endless effort, and yet to abandon it meant losing one's place in the world. A knight without means was a knight without power, and without power, even his honor could fade.
Still, the world turned quietly onward. Seasons passed, debts rose and fell, and the knight continued to play his part in the grand, slow rhythm of medieval life. Beneath the banners and the ceremony, beneath the oaths and the armor, he was simply a man, caught between survival and pride, doing his best to live with dignity in a world that demanded much and gave little. And so, he learned to find peace not in riches or recognition, but in small, humble moments, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the loyal breath of a horse beside him, the quiet strength of prayer before sleep. Because even in a world built on appearances, there was a deeper truth that no debt could touch: the worth of a man's heart. And somewhere, in the stillness of a castle's silent chamber, a knight closes his eyes, not as a lord of wealth, but as a simple soul, at rest beneath the weight of his shining, borrowed world. The songs of old tell us of love, shining, noble, and eternal. They speak of knights who pledged their hearts to ladies fair, of secret glances from castle balconies, of poems written beneath moonlight. Yet, like much in the Middle Ages, the truth was softer, quieter, and far less romantic than the stories claimed. For most knights, love was not a matter of passion, but of duty. Marriage was often arranged, a bond between families, sealed for land, alliance, or favor. A young knight might be promised to a woman he hardly knew, their union agreed upon long before affection had a chance to grow. The ceremony would be simple but solemn, vows spoken before a priest, a feast shared among kin, and then life together, not as lovers in song, but as partners in survival. Still, not all marriages were cold. Many knights grew fond of their wives over time, in the quiet rhythm of castle life, in shared meals, in evenings by the fire, in the raising of children. Small kindnesses became their own form of love. It was not the kind that poets sang of, but it was real, built from patience, respect, and endurance. Yet even so, loneliness lingered. The life of a knight was one of movement, called away by lords, by battles, by duty. He might spend months or years away from home, riding across distant lands, sleeping beneath unfamiliar skies. Letters were rare, and messages traveled slowly. Wives waited in silence, tending the estate, watching the horizon for the faint hope of his return. The poets of the age wrote of courtly love, a fantasy where a knight devoted himself to an unattainable lady, serving her through loyalty and noble deeds. It was a dream of purity and devotion, untouched by the hardships of real life. But in truth, such love was often only imagined, a polite game of admiration, more about honor than emotion. Behind the poetry lay a different reality. Long absences strained bonds. Some knights found companionship elsewhere during their travels, while others returned home to find distance between themselves and those they had left behind. The world did not judge these quiet heartbreaks harshly. It simply accepted them as part of the order of things. Loneliness was the hidden companion of the chivalric life. In moments between battles or during sleepless nights, a knight might sit alone in his tent, listening to the soft wind move through the canvas. He might think of home, of his wife, his children, or the quiet halls of his castle, and feel a hollow ache that no victory could fill. Even within the castle walls, solitude found its way in. A lady might stand by the window, her candle flickering beside her, gazing into the dark fields below. She might whisper a prayer for her husband's safety, not knowing if he was still alive or if he thought of her at all. Time stretched slowly for those who waited. The days turned to weeks, the seasons to years. There were stories of knights who returned home older, quieter, their faces lined with years of duty. They would walk through their own halls as if through a dream, familiar yet distant. Their children, once small, had grown. Their wives, once bright with youth, carried a softness of patience and time. And though they loved what they found, something had been lost in the long silence between them. The emotional cost of chivalry was not sung about in taverns or written into chronicles, but it lived quietly in the hearts of those who served. To be loyal, to obey, to fight. These were virtues, but they also required sacrifice. The sacrifice of closeness, of shared years, of the simple warmth of companionship. A knight's heart, trained to be brave and strong, often learned to endure without complaint. Yet when the night was long and the fire burned low, even the strongest heart could feel the weight of its own solitude. In that stillness, many knights turned to faith for comfort. They prayed not only for victory, but for peace within, for forgiveness, for connection, for understanding. Some found solace in the rhythm of prayer, others in quiet contemplation beneath the stars. Love in the Middle Ages was rarely as grand as the songs made it seem. It was fragile and uncertain, shaped by distance, duty, and silence. But perhaps in its quiet endurance, it held a different kind of beauty. The beauty of those who kept believing in connection, even when the world demanded separation. As the castle sleeps, the halls are hushed. A single candle flickers in a narrow window. Somewhere far away, a knight on horseback looks up at the same sky. Two lives bound by oath and distance breathe beneath the same stars. And though oceans of silence may lie between them, in that shared night there is a faint, unspoken tenderness, the kind that survives without words, without songs, without promises. Just the quiet hope that love, in some small way, still remembers. To understand the life of a medieval knight, one must first understand the invisible armor he wore, not of steel, but of belief. It was called the Code of Chivalry, a set of ideals that promised to shape the perfect knight, loyal, brave, merciful, and just. It was both a guide and a burden, a shining dream in a world that was often far from perfect. The code was not written all at once. It grew slowly through centuries, woven from faith, tradition, and poetry. It called on knights to serve God, to protect the weak, to honor their word, and to fight only for rightful causes. In songs and sermons, the chivalric knight stood as a symbol of virtue, a man whose strength was matched by his humility, whose sword was guided by conscience. But beyond the pages of poems and prayers, real life was less clear. The world was filled with hunger, power, and politics. Lords quarreled, kings demanded loyalty, and wars were fought for reasons that had little to do with justice. The knight, caught between ideal and order, often found himself standing at the edge of two worlds, one of shining virtue and one of harsh necessity.
To serve one's lord faithfully was a sacred duty, yet that same lord might command acts that weighed heavily on the heart. The knight's oath demanded obedience, even when the soul whispered doubt. In these quiet conflicts, the true test of chivalry was not found in battlefields, but in the chambers of the mind, in the moments when duty and conscience quietly wrestled beneath the stillness of armor. Many knights did their best to live by the code. They prayed, they protected, they gave charity when they could. Some refused cruel orders, risking their own honor to spare others from harm. But even the most noble men were human, bound by weakness and the world's unrelenting tide. There were times when ideals bent beneath the weight of survival. The poets, of course, spoke only of the bright side, the gallant rescues, the noble duels, the vows of loyalty. But behind those stories were countless smaller moments, a knight choosing silence rather than protest, a weary man offering a prayer for forgiveness before sleep, a quiet act of kindness that no bard would ever sing. In truth, the Code of Chivalry was more than a rule book. It was a mirror. It reflected what men wished to be, even if they could not always live up to it. It reminded them to strive for goodness, to believe in honor, and to seek grace in an imperfect world. In the still evenings, after the armor was set aside, a knight might read a psalm or listen to a traveling priest speak of virtue. The candlelight would flicker across his face as he thought of his actions, his choices, and his faith. The room would be quiet but heavy with thought, a small sanctuary where a man wrestled with the meaning of his own heart. Chivalry, at its heart, was not about perfection. It was about striving, about holding on to goodness even when the world made it difficult. To protect the innocent, to speak truth, to keep one's word. These were simple things, but in the uncertainty of the Middle Ages, they were also acts of quiet courage. Some knights failed, and some rose above their failings, yet all lived within that delicate balance between who they were and who they wished to be. Perhaps that is what made the code so enduring. Not that it was always kept, but that men continued to believe in it, to try, even when they faltered. There is something deeply human in that effort. To be a knight was not merely to wield a sword or to serve a king. It was to face the endless struggle between pride and humility, strength and mercy, ambition and peace. And so, the true chivalric battle was not always fought with blades or banners. It was fought within, in the silence of conscience, in the long pauses before a decision, in the slow breath taken before choosing what was right. When night fell, and the castle grew quiet, a knight might walk alone through the chapel, the air filled with the scent of wax and stone. He would kneel beneath the carved figure of the Virgin Mary, his hands clasped, whispering a prayer that his heart might be as strong as his sword. Outside, the wind would move gently through the trees, the torches flickering along the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a watchman's bell would ring, marking another hour of the endless medieval night. The knight would rise, his shadow stretching long against the floor. His armor might not shine as brightly as the ideals he served, but still he carried them, imperfect yet unbroken, like a quiet light in a world of shadows. And perhaps that was chivalry's truest form, not the flawless hero of legend, but the weary man who still believed in goodness, even when it was hard to find. Every age has its heroes, and every hero meets his twilight. For centuries, the knight stood as the symbol of courage, honor, and faith, a figure wrapped in steel and story. But time, like the soft erosion of stone by wind, began to wear away the age of chivalry. The end did not come suddenly or violently. It came quietly, one invention, one reform, one war at a time. The late Middle Ages brought change that no sword could resist. New weapons appeared, crossbows, and later gunpowder and cannon. The sound of battle began to shift from the clash of blades to the distant thunder of iron. Armor, once the mark of protection and pride, grew heavier, then useless. No matter how strong the steel, it could not stop a bullet. For the first time, bravery alone could not decide a fight. A knight's skill, his years of training, his code of honor, all could be undone by a single pull of a trigger. It was not cowardice that defeated chivalry, but progress. The world had found new ways to fight, and the old ways no longer fit. At first, the nobles resisted. They spoke of honor, of valor, of tradition. They continued to ride into battle, banners high, refusing to believe their age was ending. But the world had already begun to move forward. Armies of common men, trained and equipped by kings, replaced the small bands of knights who once served under feudal lords. The sword of a single man was no longer enough to decide the fate of kingdoms. The knight's place in society began to fade. The castles that once stood proud with banners now grew quiet, their stones dark with moss and rain. The tournaments, once filled with music and color, became rarer, more like echoes of a past that people no longer needed. Some knights became soldiers for hire, serving whoever could pay. Others returned to their lands, living out their days in quiet dignity, watching the world change around them. It was not an unkind ending, only a natural one. The age of knights had fulfilled its purpose. The ideals of chivalry had shaped generations, built the foundations of loyalty, honor, and courage that would outlive the armor itself. Yet the men who had once embodied those ideals found themselves living in a world that no longer recognized them. There was sadness in that, not of tragedy, but of quiet acceptance. A knight might walk through his hall, running his hand along the cold stone, hearing his footsteps echo where laughter and music once filled the air. He might gaze upon his armor, still polished, still gleaming faintly in the candlelight, and remember the days when it was a symbol of hope. Now it was a relic, heavy, silent, and still. In towns and cities, a new world was awakening. Merchants, scholars, and craftsmen began to shape society more than warriors did. Knowledge became the new weapon, trade the new conquest. The knight, who had once ruled through strength and honor, found himself replaced by ink, coin, and learning. Some adapted, embracing the change. They became statesmen, advisors, or patrons of the arts. Others faded into memory, their names kept alive only in the family crests carved above old doorways or in stories told by firelight.
But even as their physical presence declined, the spirit of the knight endured. The ideals of loyalty, courage, and compassion did not vanish. They simply transformed. They found new forms,
in explorers crossing oceans, in thinkers challenging ignorance, and ordinary people standing for what was right. The armor was gone, but the heart beneath it lived on. The poets of later ages would look back with nostalgia, writing of shining armor and noble quests. They romanticized what had been difficult, turning the struggles of real men into graceful tales of gallantry. And in doing so, they gave the knights immortality of another kind, not in battle, but in memory. As the centuries passed, the image of the knight became softer, dreamlike. Children heard stories of King Arthur, of valor and dragons and impossible honor. They imagined a world of endless sunsets and eternal courage. But behind those stories, the truth remained that the knights were human, imperfect, and deeply bound to their time. Now, when we look at a ruined castle, its towers broken and walls worn by centuries of rain, we can almost feel the echo of hooves on stone, the faint ring of armor in the wind. It is a sound that belongs to another world, one that once believed in shining codes and gentle strength. The end of the knight was not truly an end. It was a transformation. The armor was set aside, but the ideals it carried were passed down quietly, like a torch that never fully dimmed. Even today, when we speak of honor, courage, or kindness, we are echoing the same ancient code that once guided men through the shadows of a harsher age. And so, as the medieval knight draws to a close, the knight rides not into battle, but into memory, a figure of peace now, moving through the mists of time. The wind hums softly through the empty halls, carrying whispers of oaths long kept and dreams long gone. Somewhere in that endless silence, the spirit of the knight still lingers, not as a warrior, but as a symbol of hope, gently reminding the world that even when ages change, the light of honor never truly fades. Though the clatter of armor has long since faded, and the banners of chivalry have turned to dust, the image of the knight has never truly vanished. It lingers, quietly, in the stories we tell, in the art we cherish, and in the small, unseen acts of courage that still shape the human heart. The medieval knight, that figure of steel and spirit, became more than a warrior. Over time, he became a symbol. Painters, poets, and dreamers of later centuries looked back on the Middle Ages not as they truly were, but as they wished them to be. A world of noble quests, shining honor, and endless sunsets over stone castles. It was a romantic vision, soft around the edges, filled with hope for something purer than the world they lived in. In truth, the knights had been men like any other, flawed, burdened, often uncertain. But memory has a way of softening what time once made hard. The sharp lines of reality faded, and what remained was an ideal, a vision of humanity's better self. Through the centuries, the knight's image became a mirror of the age that remembered him. In the Renaissance, he was painted as a hero of virtue and learning, a man of both strength and wisdom. In the 19th century, the poets of Europe revived the tales of Arthur and his Round Table, turning chivalry into a dream of lost beauty and moral grace. And in the modern world, he became something entirely else, a timeless symbol of standing for what is right, even when it is difficult. Stories of knights endure because they speak to something deep within us. The longing for courage, for loyalty, for purpose. They remind us that even in ordinary lives, we can act with quiet nobility. The sword and armor may be gone, but kindness and integrity are still their modern forms. In art, the knight became a figure of melancholy beauty, often shown riding toward the horizon, his face hidden, his purpose unknown. Painters used him to express solitude, poets used him to explore honor, and writers used him to question the nature of goodness itself. He was both real and mythical, both human and eternal. Children still hear tales of gallant knights rescuing those in need, though the dragons they face today are different. Fear, doubt, injustice, indifference. In every story of someone who stands up for what is right, who protects the weak or keeps their word even when it costs them, there is a trace of that same old code. The spirit of chivalry has simply changed its armor. Even the word knight still holds a kind of quiet reverence. It suggests not just rank or title, but a way of being, a reminder that dignity and compassion can walk hand in hand. Modern knighthoods, though symbolic, carry echoes of that medieval promise: to serve with honor, to uphold what is good, and to bring light into dark places. In museums, suits of armor stand motionless under soft light, empty, silent, gleaming like shells of a vanished time. People look at them with a strange mixture of awe and sadness. The steel, once alive with motion and breath, now holds only the ghost of its purpose. Yet in that stillness, there is beauty. It is a reminder that every age leaves behind its symbols, and that meaning lives not in the object, but in the memory. Sometimes, when we walk through old castles or across quiet fields where battles once raged, we can almost feel their presence, not as spirits, but as stories woven into the air. The stones remember the footsteps. The wind carries the whispers of forgotten oaths. The world has changed, but its echoes remain. The knight's greatest victory was not in battle, but in endurance. His body faded, his weapons rusted, his castles fell. Yet the ideals he carried survived the centuries. They found their way into laws, into literature, into the quiet expectations we still hold for ourselves and others. Honor, loyalty, courage, humility. These are not relics. They are threads still woven through modern life. Perhaps that is why we still dream of knights, not because we long for their wars, but because we long for their certainty. The belief that goodness could be lived, not just imagined. In a world of noise and doubt, that image offers comfort. The idea that even in imperfection, one could strive toward grace. And so, as we look back across the centuries, the knight remains, not as a relic of the past, but as a quiet guide. His shining armor may have dimmed, but his light endures in smaller, more human forms. In the nurse who stays through the night, in the friend who stands by another in silence, in the person who chooses honesty when it would be easier not to. The knights of old may sleep under the earth, but their spirit still moves gently among us, reminding the world that courage does not always need a sword, and that honor can live even in the softest heart.
And somewhere, in the quiet space between history and dream, a lone figure rides slowly into the fading light, not to conquer, but simply to continue, carrying with him the timeless echo of what it means to be good. Long after the clang of swords faded and the banners of noble houses fell to dust, the world refused to let the knights disappear. Their stories lived on, reshaped, retold, and reborn with every passing century. In the quiet spaces between truth and imagination, a legend began to grow. It began with poets, men who never saw a battlefield but who dreamed of courage and purity in a world that often lacked both. They took the rough edges of real knights and polished them into something brighter. No longer were they weary soldiers bound by duty and debt. In the poets' hands, they became guardians of virtue, seekers of the holy, defenders of love. In the halls of medieval courts, storytellers spun tales by firelight. The listeners, wrapped in cloaks and wonder, heard of King Arthur and his round table, of Sir Lancelot's valor, of Gawaine's loyalty, of quests for sacred cups that promised redemption. These stories were not history, yet they became something more powerful than truth. They became ideals. The Arthurian legends, born of Celtic whispers and French imagination, reshaped how the world remembered knighthood. They transformed men of armor into symbols of hope. Each tale carried the promise that beyond human flaw, there was still something noble worth reaching for, even if only in dreams. Artists followed. Painters and sculptors gave faces to these imagined heroes, wrapping them in gold light and holy purpose. Their works filled cathedrals and palaces, turning myth into memory. The knights of canvas and stone looked serene, gazing beyond the present as if toward eternity. Centuries later, when the real age of knights was long gone, their legends found new life in books and music. During the Romantic period, poets like Tennyson breathed fresh air into ancient stories, filling them with longing and beauty. His Idylls of the King spoke not just of battles, but of the quiet ache of human weakness and the endless search for moral perfection. Victorian readers adored these stories. They saw in them a reflection of their own struggles, a desire for decency in a world growing colder with industry and change. The knight became a symbol of moral clarity, a reminder of lost virtues amidst the noise of progress. In time, the legends reached the stage, then the screen. The first silent films showed gallant knights in shining armor rescuing princesses from shadowy towers. Later, great epics would bring these myths to life with color and sound, cinematic dreamscapes filled with honor, betrayal, and destiny. Each generation reshaped the myth to fit its own heart. In some ages, the knight was a hero. In others, a tragic figure lost in an unkind world. Yet the essence remained, the longing for goodness, the belief that one could still stand firm against darkness even when imperfect. The modern world, with all its speed and noise, still pauses for these stories. In books, in games, in art, the knight rides again, not as a soldier, but as a symbol of the timeless dream of integrity. When a character stands for what is right despite the odds, when courage meets kindness, the spirit of chivalry quietly returns. It's strange to think how far these legends have traveled, from medieval songbooks to global cinema, from parchment to pixels. But perhaps it's not strange at all. Humanity has always needed stories that reach beyond what is real, that remind us who we wish to be. In the quiet glow of night, when we hear of a lone rider on a misty road, sword by his side, heart heavy with purpose, something ancient stirs in us. The image is older than memory, deeper than fact. It belongs to the collective dream of our species, a vision of a world where honor matters, where kindness is strength, and where every heart can still be noble. Even the idea of the knight in shining armor, though now a metaphor, continues to live in everyday speech. We use it not for soldiers, but for anyone who stands up for another, who faces hardship with grace, who carries a gentle courage. The legend has become part of language itself. Some might say that the myths are foolish, that they hide the harsh truths of history behind polished armor. But legends are not meant to record facts. They are meant to protect hope. And hope, though fragile though it is, has a way of surviving every age. The dream of the knight endures not because it was ever real, but because it should have been. It reminds us that within the flaws of humanity there is still the potential for beauty. The real knights of history may have faltered, but in our stories they are reborn, purified by imagination, shining with ideals that reality could not sustain. And so the legend never truly died. It sleeps quietly in art and music, in film and poetry, in the whispered wish that there might still be such goodness in the world. Every time we tell these tales, around a campfire, in a classroom, or in the quiet glow of a screen, we awaken it once more. Somewhere, beyond time and memory, a knight still rides beneath a silver moon. His armor gleams softly, his purpose uncertain yet unwavering. He is no longer bound to a castle or a crown, only to the enduring dream that humanity might someday live up to its own stories. As dawn broke on the modern world, the age of knights faded quietly into history. It did not end in battle or in grand ceremony, but in silence, a slow surrender to time. The castles that once echoed with the clatter of armor grew still, their walls softened by moss and wind. The tournament ceased, the banners fell, and the once mighty order of knighthood slipped gently into legend. The 15th and 16th centuries brought a transformation the old world could not resist. Gunpowder thundered across fields that had once been ruled by swords and lances. The armor that had protected a knight became a burden, heavy and useless against cannon fire. Warfare had changed forever, and with it, the very purpose of the knight.
In time, the title of knight became ceremonial, bestowed not for battle, but for contribution to art, science, or service. Modern knights do not carry swords. They carry legacies. They serve not kings, but humanity itself. The form changed, but the heart remained. Somewhere in the ruins of a forgotten fortress, a helmet may still rest beneath layers of earth, its metal dulled by centuries, its purpose long fulfilled. Yet, if you hold it in your hands or even imagine it, you might still sense something lingering inside, a quiet presence, a whisper of devotion, a memory of courage. The Middle Ages may seem far away, but time has a way of looping back on itself. The dreams of knighthood, of honor, love, and purpose still live in the stories we tell to comfort ourselves. In moments of solitude, when we wish to believe in something greater, we reach for the same ideals that once guided men beneath banners of silk and sky. And though the real world has grown far beyond the reach of castles and kingdoms, the longing for meaning remains. Every generation rediscovers it in its own way, in kindness, in sacrifice, in quiet acts of integrity that need no armor at all. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of the knight, not the battles fought or the oaths sworn, but the idea that one can still live with dignity in a world that does not always reward it. The sword was only ever a symbol. The real strength lay in restraint, in compassion, in the courage to act rightly even when unseen. In the hush of evening, if you listen closely, the echoes of that world still hum beneath the surface of our own. The rhythm of hooves, the rustle of banners, the soft murmur of forgotten prayers, all blend into the distant song of time. The knight's long sleep is not of death, but of rest. His story has been told so often that he no longer needs to live it. The world remembers for him. In every tale of sacrifice, in every act of honor, he stirs faintly, not as a man of metal, but as a symbol of what humanity once dared to dream. And so, beneath the endless sky, the knight rests, his sword laid beside him, his duty done. Around him, the grass grows tall, and the stars keep watch. The wars have ended, the castles have crumbled, and the world has moved on. But in the gentle quiet of history, he sleeps with peace, not forgotten, but transformed. For legends never truly die, they only change their shape. And somewhere in the hearts of those who still believe in decency, courage, and grace, the knight lives on, eternal, silent, and at rest.